And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session. As mentioned, I'm Jonathan, and this is Hans from Logility. And so far today, the sessions have really been focused on trying to climb the individual peaks that we see. But what we want to do today is share some insights and some learnings from how we're helping companies actually climb these peaks in parallel, because when they do that, that's when they're able to really achieve the notion of building a resilient supply chain. So let me start with a little bit of an analogy. So this is a triangle, and this is a common analogy in supply chain of the planning triangle, where what we're trying to do is balance the notion of service and inventory and cost. And this has been known for a while, but this is becoming an increasing challenge, and it's changed actually. It's no longer the triangle, it's actually in fact a square. And the reason it's a square is because we still have to balance the notion of service, inventory, and cost, but we also now have an additional lever, and that lever is sustainability. And why that is because companies are now having to balance the fact that it's not just having to balance those three things, but they also have to understand what is the sustainable impact of their supply chain when they deliver that service to their customers. So this is hard, right? This is a difficult problem, and that's why we want to try and help today to give insights into how companies can actually travel up these three peaks together to be able to meet that paradigm of the planning square. The way that we do that at Logility is through the use of our technology, through the use of a digital end-to-end supply chain platform, because once we can integrate all of that data into one platform across those different planning processes that you can see there, from product conception all the way through to customer delivery, that with the combination of machine learning and then analytics to help visualize and make easier the decision making, then that's where we can help companies conquer that peak. So let's start first with this peak planning mountain. And what we want to look at here is we want to look at peak planning from the aspect of inventory. So what I'm sharing here is a graph, and down the bottom you can see the timeline, and on the right-hand side is the amount of inventory that is being held by EU companies in billions of euros. So what you see is coming in pre-COVID, we were hanging around about 40 billion of euros, and before that it was a little bit less. We see obviously a significant dip because of the impact of the COVID pandemic. But look what happens after COVID. We see a massive acceleration of the holding of inventories, and that continues well past where we were before and goes well on into about the 60 billion mark, dropping a little bit now. The reason it accelerated so much is that companies were buffering. And the reason they were buffering inventory was they were trying to build resiliency in their supply chain after everything that had happened, which I guess is quite natural. The problem is companies are not very good at buffering. They're not very good at right-sizing their inventory. And what happens is they dump it. They dump it either through margin markdown, they dump it through obsolescence, it goes to waste. And our thought is that the question is that's not very sustainable. To be able to build up those inventories and then just dump them is not a sustainable way of doing business. So Hans, let me hand over to you to share some techniques of how we can help companies improve this.
Thank you, Jonathan. As Jonathan mentioned, there's more and more inventory with companies. They hold more and more stock because of resilience, but also because they work in silos. They operate in silos. And I'll give you an example when looking at this particular view of let's say, a medium complex supply chain, but a typical one that you can see within many different industries, with customers, with DCs, with plants, with factories, suppliers. And what we see and what we notice is that there's variability, a lot of demand variability, increase of demand variability, because of changing customer behavior, but also because of that events, external events that drive that variability. And that variability ripples through the supply chain to DCs, and further on in the supply chain. Similarly, we see at the supply side, lead time variability change, also in inbound flows, but also in production. And to add to the complexity, what we see is there, in most cases, we have configured items with multiple production steps. So how much inventory do we need to hold at each stage of the production process. Well, instead of what we do is wrong, right? Having a lot of inventory at all stages of the all stages and all nodes of the supply chain. So we have to break down the silos. We have to interpret inventories holistically, and we need to analyze them and right-size them. And that's what we need to do. So in this case, it's important to right-size your inventory, and the Logility platform can help you do that. And I want to give you an example what it can look like in the solution. Here we have a typical inventory review report. And what we can see here on the left-hand side in the graph is the inventory projection for the next year for this company in volume. And what we see here on the right-hand side is the same graph, but then in value, because we understand the value as it has for that particular inventory projection. And the inventory investment is shown here, but it moves over time. And this is the, let's say, the inventory projection that you would need to get a fixed service level over time that you can see in the dotted line. We also notice here that there's some seasonality. So if you have seasonal products, then of course your safety stocks, your stocks need to take that into account. And what you see in the middle section here is the 3 different scenarios that we created. So for example, we have a base scenario that contains your current plan, for example, with your inventory positions as it is. We created a second scenario that is optimizing inventory within the plants, within the locations, but not looking at it holistically. And the third scenario that we have is a scenario that we have optimized holistically. And of course, if you look at it in a detail, you can see that that last scenario, the one that is optimized across the end-to-end supply chain, has the lowest total inventory cost. If we zoom in on the finished goods, we see there is less stock for the optimized scenario. If we look at the sub-assemblies, however, we can see that there is more stock. But again, remember, overall, the overall inventory costs are lower, and of course, we're keeping the same service level guaranteed.
Thanks, Hans. Some really good techniques there. So it's really a question of balance. And an example of a company who is achieving that balance is Clarios. They make batteries for cars. And what Clarios has been able to achieve is that they've actually reduced their inventory, but at the same time, they've actually improved their service level. And when they improve their service level, they also are able to reduce their lead time to their customers, which in turn gives them market share and ultimate revenue. So really good example of using those techniques, those multi-echelon inventory optimization techniques that Hans was just demonstrating for us. So if we move on, the next one to look at is we want to conquer the mount visibility. And let me share with you a picture. So in this picture, 2 cars. So very similar in the sense of they are the top of the range model from Tesla in terms of the electric car, and then the top of the range model from Porsche, which is the Taycan. There are some differences though between the two. You can see that with the data below around speed, range, how fast they go around the Nuremberg ring, etc. There is also, however, another big difference between these 2 cars. And that is, if you tried to buy a Porsche Taycan last year off the dealership, that would have been really, really difficult. They had an issue with delivery lead times compared with Tesla. And the reason for that is, like a lot of manufacturers, they had issues with components, shortages of components. And it wasn't just semiconductors. It was actually also, in this example, the wiring harness because of the war in Ukraine. Tesla did not have that issue. They had a dual sourcing strategy in place that they could get components, the same components, from other suppliers. So they had built visibility and resiliency into their supply chain, which ultimately allowed them to sell more vehicles than Porsche could make in that period. And Hans, I think you're going to share some techniques with us about how that can be achieved.
Yes, so how can we make it visible? Here I'm sharing a particular view where we show the resiliency index. And as Jonathan mentioned, multi-sourcing reduces risk. And we represent that risk by a so-called resiliency index. That takes into account the number of different suppliers that you might have, and then weighted against the average volume for each item, the spend you have on the item, and maybe different price settings between different suppliers. And one thing, because the Logility platform is really end-to-end and understands both and links all the nodes between supply and demand, we were able to see what is the impact of that resiliency index on our demands. And so for each customer, we can say, okay, this is a particular revenue that is at risk because your resiliency index, your risk that you have, is pretty high. So we're not talking only about multi-sourcing. Another way to visualize is to look at compliancy, because you want to have visibility in the compliancy of your suppliers. So how much are they certified? Do they apply to your rules, or maybe even governmental rules? And what we can see is, and they can range from any perspective, but typically it's about environmental, it's about quality, security, and sustainability, right? And when we talk about sustainability, it's just not one, let's say, ESG metric that we're going to use, but we can collect and coordinate multiple metrics that in total make up one, let's say, ESG score. So we can look at different plants, what they produce, how much energy they use, how much water they use, etc. And we can make that visible and score vendors and rate them based on that. And we don't do that only for just your first tier supplier, but we can do that for multiple tiers in your supply chain. So think of the following example. So one of our customers is PVH, that owns brands like Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. And of course, they are in the fashion industry, and there's not just one tier. Within that fashion industry, there's like 5, 6 tiers. So think of cotton farms, fabric mills, yarn spinners, the finished good manufacturers, before it even gets imported by these companies and being sold, right? And if you import either in the EU or in the US these goods, there's regulation that says, okay, we want to make sure that these products are originating from, not from the Xinjiang region, for example. So it needs to be cotton that is coming from China, because China delivers most of the cotton, but we want to make sure that it's not from that region. And again, this is not the first tier supply, but 5th tier. So our platform gives visibility or traceability in all these tiers, and will tell what the origin of the product is.
Thank you, Hans. So some great techniques that we've shared there. So far, we've conquered the peak planning with regards to better balancing of our inventory and blending that with the sustainability aspect, no obsolescence or waste. We've then been giving you some insight into the visibility that we need to get within the multi-tier supply chain, but also to understand the compliance impact. But what we want to do now then is bring that all together to be able to kind of present that to the consumer as proof points around the sustainability of the supply chain that we are actually running. And that's important, because we're seeing more and more from research. This is a research piece from McKinsey and Nielsen that says when consumers can see that there are proof points around the sustainability and compliance of a company's products, they are willing to potentially change brands and also maybe spend more on that product when that proof is seen from a consumer perspective. So that's becoming more and more important. Obviously, that's one of the reasons why we see that planning square. We need to balance that aspect. But it has to be done correctly, because we see examples, and here is a very recent example from a well-known Dutch airline that just last week was actually accused of greenwashing and had to remove some of the claims it made around sustainability because they were proved to be incorrect. So there's almost a converse thing that's damage to the brand, because they're not able to back up the proof claims around how compliant, ethical, and sustainable their supply chain is. So Hans, you're going to share some techniques about how we can make this happen as well.
Yes, so let me show how we can bring it together. We can bring everything together, so visibility, planning, and sustainability, by representing and modeling your supply chain within a digital twin. So we can model nodes in your supply chain, routings, constraints, demands, and we can optimize it, right? We can optimize it based on cost, we can optimize it based on best service, and of course, having visibility on the impact of each of these plans. Because what we can do is create scenarios. For example, just simple greenfield analysis. Where do you want to put your a new DC, for example? What's the most optimal? And again, it's very easy because it's in memory. It will just open this pop-up. You say, I want to create a new scenario. I want to move, and you can drag and drop a DC to anywhere, other location, and see what is the impact. And you want to then be able to compare it. And this is a view where we can compare it. So let's say we have multiple scenarios that we generate, a new plant or a plant shutdown, a port might have a strike, for example. So what will happen to my cost? And that could be manufacturing cost, transportation cost, facility lease, what have you. But also your service time. Is your service time improving or decreasing? And then lastly, important, that sustainability part. So what's my impact on my CO2 if I do these things? So we bring it all together within the digital twin, but imagine we can also bring it for individual products together. So let's imagine you have a QR code that customers can scan, and that QR code contains information about the product, about information about the color and the size and what have you. But it can also then be linked to all the nodes in the tiers in your supply chain. So we've traced it. We know where it's coming from, so we know the origin of the supply, and we know whether it's compliant with our rules and with the government rules. And lastly, of course, because we know all the nodes in the network, we know how much for each supplier, how much CO2 impact there is. We can really make a product passport, a digital product passport that tells you this is a product that is sustainable and it's proven. So, I mean, this will give customers a brand loyalty. It will increase your market share and will create happy customers and a happy planet. So,
yeah, thank you, Hans. A great example of the vision that we can start to bring that information back to the consumer. So in summary, we've kind of challenged you a little bit. I know we've been talking about the 3 peaks and kind of climbing those individually, but what we've tried to share today is those techniques and support around using technology that ultimately allows us to climb those peaks in parallel and ultimately get to that one peak of building a resilient supply chain. So thank you for listening. We have our booth upstairs as well if there are any further questions, and thank you for your time.